Hello there, welcome to Planet America. I'm John Barron.
And I'm Chester Chadai.
This week, closing arguments in Trump's New York criminal trial. We'll find out what happens next.
Meanwhile, Joe Biden is trailing in the polls and now in the money race as well. There is so much happening, so let's get started.
There were closing arguments in Donald Trump's business records and hush money trial in New York today, and now it is up to the jury to decide whether the former president is a criminal or not. Defense attorney Todd Blanche listed the reasons he thinks the jury should acquit Trump, describing the key witness, Michael Cohen, as the human embodiment of reasonable doubt, literally. Blanche concluded by asking the jurors not to send his client, Mr. Trump, to prison. That incurred the ire of the usually rather calm judge, Juan Merchan, who chided Blanche for a blatant and wholly inappropriate effort to attract sympathy for Trump. Prosecution attorney Joshua Steinglass then gave a lengthy summation of the case against Trump, weaving together the strands of what he called a conspiracy and a cover-up to influence the outcome of the 2016 election by paying hush money to Stormy Daniels and then fraudulently claiming it was for legal fees. Well, joining us for more to tell us what might happen next, Ronald Sullivan, leading expert on criminal law and defence trial practice, professor of law at Harvard Law School, also a former legal advisor to Barack Obama's presidential campaigns. Professor Sullivan, welcome to Planet America.
Thank you so much for having me.
So, when the defence attorney asked the jury not to send his client Donald Trump to prison, the judge got really upset and said it was inappropriate. It actually seems like quite a reasonable thing to ask a jury. What was the problem with that?
It might seem like a reasonable thing to ask. However, it's a big no-no in the American criminal justice system. You cannot talk about punishment to the jury. So the jury is the finder of fact. They are the judges of all the facts. They judge the credibility of the witnesses, and they make a determination based on the facts. Now, sentencing is in the exclusive province of the judge, so it is improper, and the defense attorney knew that. It's improper to say anything about potential exposure in jail. That is sanctionable. So that's why the judge got upset. An experienced attorney should not be saying things like that.
Professor, how much would jurors be aware of the discussions going on outside the courtroom about this case?
In theory, zero. They were admonished at the beginning and throughout the entire way to not listen to any news coverage or talk about the case or read newspaper accounts about the case. They are only to consider the evidence that the judge allows in the case. So they're not supposed to have any exposure whatsoever to any of the commentary around the case. Does every juror do that? Probably not. My guess is that most jurors try really hard to avoid exposure. But in this day and age with cell phones and so forth, it's as close to impossible as you can get, because you just kind of open your cell phone and at a minimum you see headlines about this or that. So it's really hard to do. I think most jurors try, but I'm sure some jurors, in fact, surf the internet and read about it.
And Professor, have the jurors been discussing each day's events with each other as they occur, or are they not allowed to confer until after the closing arguments?
The jury is not supposed to confer until after the closing arguments. That's another rather unnatural artifact of American jury service. Yes, they cannot talk about it even amongst themselves until all the evidence in and the judge has metaphorically given the case to the jury. At that point and that point only can they begin discussion about the case.
And if they don't immediately reach a unanimous verdict, what kinds of tools does the judge have to push them along, try and help them attain some kind of agreement?
None. So the judge, the court officers, nobody can have any influence inside that jury room. It is supposed to be a completely closed off space. So the jury and the jury alone comes to a decision. If they have questions, the foreperson will ask the judge a question by way of a written document, and then the judge will call in the lawyers from both sides and say, I have this question. I intend to respond this way. What do you think? The parties will argue about it, and the judge will come back with some sort of response or say that's a question that I can't answer.
And ultimately, what happens if there is a hung jury? Is a retrial automatic at that point?
If there is a hung jury, in the first instance, the judge will read an instruction that urges the jury to go back in and give it another go. But if, as you say, the jury comes back and says there is no reasonable prospect of us coming to a verdict, the judge will declare a mistrial. At that point, it is up to the prosecution as to whether the prosecution will retry the case. They have that availability. It's not mandatory. It's a discretionary call by the prosecution office.
Professor, what's the role of the judge's instructions to the jury? And is there a particular issue with the judge's instructions in this case that could be potentially grounds for an appeal down the track?
Yeah, absolutely. So the instructions are vitally important because they set the framework. So the jury is the exclusive judge of the facts, but the judge is the exclusive judge of the law. So the judge tells the jury, this is the law, and you have to decide the case within this framework. Now, if a judge gives a bad instruction, that could be grounds for what we call reversible error, where an appellate court will come back and say, no, judge, you should not have given that instruction. It prejudiced the defense, and we have to do this all over again. We're overturning the conviction. So an appeal is only relevant if there's a conviction. You cannot appeal an acquittal. If there's an acquittal, then our double jeopardy clause, the double jeopardy clause in the Constitution of the United States, bars any further or second bite at the apple. Only if there's a conviction can there be an appeal.
Professor, I'm not sure if you've formed a view based on the fact that we can just see the transcripts and the reports from the court, but from what you've seen and heard, does it feel to you as though this trial has been conducted in a reasonable and fair fashion, regardless of what the verdict might be?
It has been tried in a fair, reasonable fashion with very good and competent lawyers on both sides. I think the defense has done enough to get reasonable doubt. However, the case is in a jurisdiction where former President Trump is not particularly well liked, so that might militate in favor of the prosecution. But we will soon see.
Professor Ronald Sullivan, thank you for joining us on Planet America.
Thank you so much. Be well.
Your choice, 2024.
Never forget, America's the strongest when we lead not only by our example of our power, but by the power of our example. You can clap for that.
A lot of people say to me today, the toughest business people that you know about, could I ask you a question? How do you do it? I say, do what? How do you get up in the morning and put your pants on? Where do you put the pants on?
Choose wisely.
This week, Donald Trump became the first former US president to address the Libertarian Party's national convention. America's libertarians are kind of a blend of classical liberalism, small government conservatism, and progressive civil liberties and diversity. And they can draw from both the left and the right. But despite declaring himself to be a libertarian, the three-time Republican Party nominee did not get the warmest of receptions.
Now I think you should nominate me or at least vote for me, and we should win together.
Trump did come bearing a few gifts, though. First, he promised to free and pardon Ross Ulbricht. He's the founder of the Silk Road website, who was jailed for life in 2015 for drug dealing and money laundering. And then Trump dangled this.
That I will put a libertarian in my cabinet and also libertarians in senior posts. Pretty good. That's pretty big.
Again, a mixed reaction at best. There is plenty of crossover, though, between Libertarians and Republicans. Back in 2016, two former Republican governors, Gary Johnson and Bill Weld, were nominated for the presidency and vice presidency by the Libertarians, and they claimed almost 4.5 million votes, Chaz.
Yeah, you can probably understand Libertarians not entirely trusting that Trump would commute the sentence of convicted drug dealer Ross Ulbricht, given A, he had 4 years to do that when he was president, and he didn't. And B, Trump's policy on convicted drug dealers is, well, this.
But we're going to be asking everyone who sells drugs, gets caught selling drugs, to receive the death penalty for their heinous acts.
That's pretty far from a pardon, John.
Yeah, it all depends on your audience, I guess. Also spruiking for that Libertarian nomination this week was Democrat-turned-independent Robert Kennedy Jr., who got a much warmer reception, you'd have to say. He then proceeded, though, to unplug his own microphone.
Can you hear me?
What is with that guy? I don't know if it's the brain worm, but Kennedy would have to be the most technologically inept candidate since Richard Nixon, who only needed that automatic tape recording system in the Oval Office because he couldn't press 2 buttons. And that's why Watergate was revealed. But to be fair, Kennedy's speech, which focused on constitutional limits on government power, was better targeted to his audience than Trump's threats were. Kennedy also attacked Trump's claim to be a libertarian because of his response to the COVID pandemic in 2020.
With the lockdowns, the mask mandates, the travel restrictions, President Trump presided over the greatest restriction on individual liberties this country has ever known.
But in the end, Trump did not even file the paperwork to stand in the Libertarian presidential nominating contest. He explained his decision this way.
The reason I didn't file paperwork for the Libertarian nomination, which I would have absolutely gotten if I wanted it, as everyone could tell by the enthusiasm of the crowd last night, was the fact that as the Republican nominee, I'm not allowed to have the nomination of another party.
Yeah, I'm not sure that's entirely true, John, given that the Conservative Party nominated Trump in 2016 and 2020, no problems. Also, if he wasn't seeking the Libertarians nomination, he sure had a funny way of showing it.
Now I think you should nominate me, nominate us, and put us in the position. I would say nominate. The Libertarian Party should nominate Trump for President of the United States. Whoa. That's nice.
That was not nice. But a cynic might suggest that Trump backed out after being surprised by the poor reception he received. Of course, Utah Senator Mike Lee would defy those cynics because he assured us all that wasn't the case. He said the boos were from paid agitators, and the overwhelming share of the actual libertarians in attendance were enthusiastic and supportive of Trump. And if that was the case, then the Libertarians had a funny way of showing it.
Ms. McGardle, I'd like to propose that we go tell Donald Trump to go f*** himself away from here. Yes!
That was my motion too.
Not subtle. Look, to be fair, at least Trump showed up. Biden certainly did not.
And the overwhelming majority of Libertarians didn't tell Trump to go f*** himself. So there's that too. Kennedy did stand in that nominating election, though. He was eliminated after the first round of voting, getting just 19 votes, 2% of the total. They had 7 rounds of balloting. In the end, the Libertarian presidential nomination went to an actual Libertarian. His name is Chase Oliver, a 38-year-old who previously described himself as pro-gun, anti-cop and pro-choice, and also as armed and gay. Chase Oliver says that he wants to win 2% of the vote in November. If he does, that could even make a difference in a close nominating contest. Meanwhile, the Biden campaign is trying to push back against the narrative that America was better off under Donald Trump. We talked about a recent poll that found that 65% of Americans remember the Trump economy as good, while just 38% say the same about today's economy under Joe Biden. So here is a not-so-subtle reminder to the American people of some of the bad stuff from the Trump era, voiced by actor Robert De Niro.
From midnight tweets to drinking bleach, to tear-gassing citizens and staging a photo op. We knew Trump was out of control when he was president. Then he lost the 2020 election and snapped, desperately trying to hold on to power. Now he's running again, this time threatening to be a dictator, to terminate the Constitution.
If I don't get elected, it's going to be a bloodbath.
Trump wants revenge, and he'll stop at nothing to get it.
Little bit to unpack there. Fact checkers do point out that Trump did not actually tell Americans infected with coronavirus to drink bleach back in 2020. He did ponder publicly whether disinfectant could be used to kill COVID by injection inside, which was pretty bad, but he did stop short of actually advocating the drinking of bleach. So there's that.
Yeah, look, let's not stop there either, because that ad is chock full of deception. Regular viewers will know that both the bloodbath and dictator for a day comments have been taken way out of context on that ad. And as for saying that he's promising to terminate the Constitution, look, that's referring to this tweet from 2022 when Trump was whinging yet again about the 2020 election. And he said that a massive fraud of this type and magnitude allows for the termination of all rules, regulations and articles, even those found in the Constitution. And yes, that is a top quality dummy spit there from Trump, yes, but it's hardly promising to terminate the Constitution in 2025 should he win, is it? But I guess, look, an ad isn't meant to be fair, is it? So I should just shut up. Let's move on.
There was an interesting poll from Emerson this week showing the potential impact of third-party candidates as well as a possible Trump conviction on this year's election. Head-to-head, Trump leads Joe Biden by 2 points, with a substantial 10% saying they're still undecided. When the undecided voters were asked who they were leaning towards, Biden and Trump were then tied. 50-50. Those undecideds broke heavily to Joe Biden. Interesting. But when the same poll offered voters alternatives, Kennedy, West and Stein, and we suddenly saw Trump spring out to a 5-point lead. 10% though, still saying, I'm undecided. Pollsters also asked what impact Trump's criminal trial would have. More than half said that a guilty verdict would make no difference at all to them. A quarter said it would make them less likely to vote for Trump. Strangely, 23% said they'd be more likely to vote for Donald Trump if he's guilty of a crime. And yes, well spotted, that has rounded out to 101% of the total. There was some more good news for Donald Trump in a series of swing state polls from Cook Political Report this week. Trump is leading in 6 and tied with Biden in 1, although Democrats may console themselves with the fact that it is closer than some other recent polls. Trump is leading in Arizona by 4, that's the same margin in Georgia as well. Trump is leading by 3 in Michigan. Biden still struggling in Nevada. He's down by 8 points, and that is the margin in North Carolina as well. In Pennsylvania, Trump leads by 3 points, and it is a tie in Wisconsin, Chaz.
Yeah, and when you dig deeper into that swing state poll there, it sheds even more light on the challenges that Joe Biden is facing. They asked the swing staters what the best markers of a strong economy were. Very few people were picking the stock market, unemployment or household income, all of which are doing great right now, by the way. By contrast, 54% said the cost of living was the best way to measure the strength of the economy, and that's not doing so well, and that is a problem for Biden. But what's worse for Biden is that 59% of voters thought that Biden has at least some control over inflation and rising costs. So they must think that he isn't trying to lower them hard enough. No wonder he's only got a 40% approval on the economy in that poll. But by contrast, 62% of swing staters approve of how Trump handled the economy. And it still gets worse for Biden even than that. Only 40% think Biden would get the cost of living under control in a second term, whereas 56% say that Trump might. And for the Biden team that's running ads about democracy, like the one we just saw voiced by Robert De Niro, bad news for those guys as well, because just 41% of swing staters said they were confident that America would remain a democracy under Trump. 41% were confident to be a democracy he's still leading the polls. They don't care. They're still voting for him anyway. So finally, for those thinking that the abortion issue will come to the rescue, 55% of the swing staters said they were more worried about Biden handling the economy than they were about Trump setting policy about abortion. So, bottom line, get the price of groceries down because no one else cares about anything else. None of that is great news for Biden.
Yeah, everyone's affected by the economy, not everyone affected by abortion, at least not today. Meanwhile, former President Trump has been campaigning in states that he is not going to win, like New York, seeking out demographic groups that could make a difference, though, in those swing states. So this week, Trump held a rally in New York's historically black and now majority Hispanic neighbourhood in the South Bronx. And over on Fox News, it was quite the novelty.
Our security guy, we have a security guy that travels with us, and Lou suggested a place, and I said, I want to go and meet the people. I want to go where we can just find randoms.
I took a security guard so I could go and meet randoms, and I suppose these were the randoms.
We want to be able to afford our rents. Who doesn't want that? And Donald Trump talks toward that.
He did more, Donald Trump did more and helped out the community more than Joe Biden.
Everybody's going to go. Everybody wants Trump to win. Trump was the best thing that happened to New York. He defended us during COVID.
In his speech, Trump played on economic insecurity, even xenophobia, telling the crowd that illegal immigrants pose the biggest threat to black and brown workers. But then about halfway through his 80-minute speech, Trump said he was tired of talking about politics. He wanted to talk instead about success, by which he meant his success.
Tremendous. I've had great success. I've had it in entertainment. I've had it in business. I've had it in politics. You know, I ran for office. What office did you run for, President? How'd you do? I won. Actually, I won twice. You know, we did much better the second time, so.
Yeah, but Biden got 7 million more votes than Trump, and that is why Trump lost. Yet remarkably, he keeps claiming to have won. We hear this lie so often, but it is worth reminding ourselves that it is indeed very much a lie.
And talking about lies, we cannot have a Trump rally without a Trump wild overestimate about crowd sizes. Happens every time. In this case, Trump claimed there were 25,000 people at the rally, but that was pretty obviously not the case.
Donald Trump came to the South Bronx today to speak to some supporters and to a fair amount of empty space in Crotona Park.
In reality, the NYPD press office said about 3,400 tickets were booked, and the patrolling officers estimated the crowd was about 3,500, so that's sounding like the number. And look, that's not actually bad for a Republican in the Bronx if Trump hadn't tremendously oversold its size. Also, as Philip Bump put it, and Philip Bump is not someone who is a Trump fan at all, he said it was much more diverse than most Trump rallies, with loads of black, Asian and Hispanic attendees. And many of them, he said, were actually from the Bronx. So that's also a positive for Trump. He just oversold it, like he always does. Trump even had some Bronxy endorsements from rappers.
They always gonna whisper your accomplishments and shout your failures. Trump gonna shout the wins for all of us. Make America great again.
Unfortunately, one thing Trump wasn't shouting about was that those two were indicted last year for being part of a vast murder conspiracy. That first guy there, Chef G, he's actually out on bail for multiple counts of murder himself as part of 27 different acts of violence and a dozen shootings. Seems like Trump might have made some friends when he got his mugshot taken. But regardless, the rally was emblematic of a larger issue, according to CNN's Harry Enton.
Look at the Crotona Park area, right? The Crotona Park precinct where that rally was held yesterday. It's a majority Hispanic precinct. Look at the trend that we're seeing right now in the polling, right? So if you look back at Hispanic voters at this point in the 2020 cycle, Joe Biden had a 25-point lead. Look at where that lead is today. It's just 7 points. Donald Trump right now at 44%, if that helped, would be the best performance for a Republican candidate among Hispanic voters since George W. Bush back in 2004.
And to complete a pretty good week for Trump, the latest fundraising figures came out. And you know, Trump's been lagging on Biden for ages there, but he's closed the gap now, with Biden raising $51 million last month and Trump raising $76 million last month. Biden's still got more money in the bank on $84 million to Trump's $49 million, but it was interesting to see the Biden campaign's reaction to these numbers. Their official statement said that their fundraising reflected, quote, strong, consistent grassroots enthusiasm, and they pinged Trump for burning through cash and lagging behind Biden's growing and aggressive campaign. But then they put out an email to donors saying, we're worried. We're not even close to the amount we raised last month at this point. So that is an interesting tactic right there, John. And as for the Trump operation, they still have more catching up to do to Biden when it comes to money at least. But with innovations like this, it's just a matter of time.
All right, folks, if you are watching this today, then I have an offer you are gonna love. You are looking at the very limited edition Trump Black Card. Listen to this. This sucker is metal, folks. We have limited quantities of this card. Come join us. Come be on the team. Come get your Trump Black Card right here.
Yes, that's right. You too can buy your metallic card that does absolutely nothing. What are you waiting for?
In the modern era, some candidates have been elected to the American presidency at their very first attempt. Jimmy Carter, Bill Clinton, George W. Bush, Barack Obama and Donald Trump. They all burst onto the scene and swept into the White House. Others have taken 2 attempts to get there. Richard Nixon and the first George Bush. Ronald Reagan tested the waters in 1968. He ran full on in 1976 before winning in 1980. Joe Biden also won at the 3rd attempt in 2020, 32 years after his first presidential run. But that's nothing. Meet Harold Stassen.
Governor Stassen, by his record in Minnesota, has become a man of national importance.
At the outbreak of the Second World War, with an approval rating of 91%, Governor Stassen resigned to serve in the US Navy. Looks like fun. Back on Civvy Street, Stassen made a brief bid for the 1944 Republican presidential nomination. And by 1948, after being a US delegate to the formation of the United Nations, Stassen was considered the Republicans' leading candidate. He took part in the first ever broadcast debate with rival Tom Dewey. Stassen called for the Communist Party to be banned.
Why is it that the Communist Party organization has been growing so strong in New York?
Good question, but Dewey won the debate and the Republican presidential nomination, and then lost to President Harry Truman in November. But Harold Stassen wasn't giving up on his White House dream.
Harold Stassen appears at a Republican rally in Detroit.
Still in his mid-40s, Stassen tried again in 1952, but couldn't get enough support, ultimately throwing his weight behind the future president.
I place before this convention for President of the United States the name of Dwight David Eisenhower.
And in return, Ike gave Harold a cabinet post.
Harold E. Stassen takes the oath as Mutual Security Director.
Stassen then became a perennial candidate. He ran for president again in 1964, 1968, 1976, 1980, and, with a new toupee, in 1988.
That's been one of the problems. Politics as usual, short-term moves. You need to look at long-term things.
At the age of 85 in 1992, Harold Stassen ran his 9th presidential campaign in 48 years.
People who stayed active in what they believed in, I think, are those in all of history that had the greatest impact.
And that was to be Stassen's last White House bid. He also ran, though, again for Governor of Minnesota, the US Senate twice, Governor of Pennsylvania also twice, Mayor of Philadelphia and US Representative, and he lost every single election. But he said he ran for another reason.
To make this world a little better place.
Then, last year, 22 years after his death, Harold Stassen became the subject of a musical.
I will be someone that you must remember.
Memorable as an example that while persistence doesn't necessarily pay off, that's not always the point.
Thank you, and good evening to you all.
And that is all the time we have for another trip to Planet America. Do join us, though, for a fireside chat with journalist and author Nick Bryant, Friday night on ABC News, talking about America's forever war with itself.
And we're going to see you back here next Wednesday at 10 p.m. ABC TV and anytime from 9 on ABC, iView and online. And don't forget, there's a brand new pet podcast available in all the usual pod places. See you there.